Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
The summer fete at Willow End had always been a gentle affair, notable chiefly for its predictability. There were stalls selling jam in carefully labelled jars, a tombola that never quite ran out of prizes, and long tables set beneath bunting that had seen better decades. The village of Barton Lee valued tradition, and tradition valued calm. Nothing truly unexpected ever happened at Willow End, until it did. Miss Jane Marple arrived just after 4 o'clock, guided along the gravel path by the soft hum of polite chatter and the reassuring clink of teacups. She wore a pale cardigan and carried a small handbag that rested comfortably against her wrist. Several people greeted her by name, smiling with the uncomplicated warmth reserved for someone regarded as harmlessly observant and entirely unthreatening. "Lovely day for it, Miss Marple," Mrs. Alcott called from behind the cake stall. "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple replied. "The weather does encourage honesty. People are always themselves when they're comfortable." Mrs. Alcott laughed without quite understanding why. The fete was in full swing. Children darted between adults, clutching sticky fingers and paper prizes. The vicar's wife presided over the tea table with practiced authority, while Mr. Edwin Harper, recently returned to Barton Lee after many years away, stood near the rose arbor speaking animatedly to a small cluster of villagers. Mr. Harper was the reason attendance had been unusually high. He had grown up in Barton Lee, left under circumstances that had never been properly explained, and returned 2 months ago with a renovated house, a confident smile, and a generous interest in village affairs. Some welcomed him warmly, others did so out of politeness. Everyone watched him. Miss Marple watched too. She noticed how Mr. Harper's laughter rang a little louder than necessary, how his gaze flicked from face to face as though checking his effect. She noticed that Mrs. Fenwick, standing near the preserves, stiffened whenever he spoke, and that her husband avoided looking at him altogether. She noticed how young Clara Dent listened with an expression that was not admiration so much as calculation. The afternoon progressed pleasantly enough. A small brass band played with uneven enthusiasm. Tea was poured. Secrets, if present, remained politely hidden beneath layers of conversation. At 5:30, Mrs. Wilton suggested a toast. "To the community," she said, raising her glass of lemonade. "To old friends and new beginnings." Glasses were raised. Smiles widened. Miss Marple sipped carefully. Mr. Harper stepped forward then, flushed with attention. "If I may," he said, "I'd like to say how glad I am to be home. Barton Lee hasn't changed. Not really. And I'm grateful for that." There was polite applause, tinged with something less comfortable. Miss Marple noticed how several people glanced instinctively at one another, as though silently checking shared memory. Mr. Harper smiled. "Some things, of course, are best left in the past." The words landed more heavily than he seemed to intend. A pause followed, brief but distinct. Mrs. Fenwick's hand trembled, spilling a little lemonade. Mr. Fenwick reached to steady her with a sharpness that betrayed strain. Miss Marple lowered her cup. It was then that the scream came. Not loud at first, more a sharp intake of breath that turned into sound as it was given voice. It came from the far end of the lawn, near the old yew tree where the raffle prizes were displayed. People turned. Someone knocked over a chair. Miss Marple rose at once, moving with surprising speed for someone of her years. Edwin Harper lay on the grass, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him, his eyes staring sightlessly at the bunting above. A glass lay shattered nearby, its contents seeping into the earth. Dr. Lewis, the village GP, pushed forward, already kneeling. He checked quickly, then again, his movements slowing. "I'm afraid," he said quietly. "He's dead." Silence spread across the lawn like a held breath. Someone began to cry. Someone else whispered, but he was just speaking. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her expression one of mild concern. She looked not at the body but at the people surrounding it. Shock, certainly. Grief, perhaps. But also something else. Relief, flickering and quickly masked. Fear that arrived too late. And calculation already beginning its careful work. "He must have collapsed," Mrs. Wilton said weakly. "The heat, perhaps." Dr. Lewis hesitated. "Possibly." Miss Marple noticed that he did not sound convinced. The constable was sent for. People were asked, politely but firmly, not to leave. The fete, so carefully arranged, had dissolved into clusters of murmured conversation. Miss Marple drifted closer to the tea-table, listening. "He always did have a weak heart," someone said. "No, that was his brother," another corrected. "I heard he'd made enemies," a third whispered. "Years ago." Miss Marple nodded gently, as though agreeing with nothing in particular. She bent slightly to examine the broken glass on the grass. Lemonade, certainly, but beneath the citrus scent there was something sharper, something faint but unmistakable to a nose that had learned to trust itself. Miss Marple straightened. She looked again at the faces gathered around Edwin Harper. The averted gazes, the too quick denials are already forming in people's minds. The careful recalibration of memory. Everyone, she reflected, was preparing to tell a story. Each story would be sincere, each would be incomplete, and every single one, in its own way, would be a lie. Miss Marple folded her hands in front of her and waited patiently for the police to arrive. The truth, she knew, would not be found in what people said next. It would be found in what they tried very hard not to say at all. The police arrived within 20 minutes, though it felt much longer to the people of Barton Lee, who had been forced to stand in the open with their discomfort and watch it grow. Constable Price came first, breathless and red-faced, followed closely by Inspector Mallory from the market town, a man with a neat moustache and the mildly irritated expression of someone accustomed to being interrupted. He took in the scene quickly, the body on the grass, the overturned chair, the broken glass, the clustered villagers who looked simultaneously eager to speak and terrified of being heard. "Dr. Lewis," he said, crouching beside Edwin Harper. "Time of death?" Dr. Lewis shook his head. "Very recent, minutes, not hours. He collapsed almost at once." "And your opinion?" Mallory asked. The doctor hesitated, his eyes flicking to the shattered glass. "I'd prefer to wait," he said carefully. "There's something about it that doesn't sit quite right." "Meaning?" Mallory prompted. Dr. Lewis lowered his voice, his skin tone, the speed of it. It could be natural, but it could also be assisted. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. Inspector Mallory stood. "All right, no one leaves. Not yet. Constable, take names. I want to know exactly who was near Mr. Harper in the last 10 minutes. The villagers complied with resentful obedience. A few protested, politely at first, and then with indignation that quickly faded under the inspector's calm stare. Barton Lee did not often deal with authority that did not defer to local sensibilities. Miss Marple remained near the tea-table, small and still, a figure who seemed more interested in the arrangement of cups than in the drama on the lawn. People glanced past her without thinking. That suited her perfectly. Mrs. Wilton, who had proposed the toast, wrung her hands in a helpless rhythm. "It's dreadful," she kept saying. "Dreadful. We were only celebrating." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, as if to herself. "Celebrations do have a way of loosening things." Mrs. Wilton blinked at her. "I'm sorry." "Nothing, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "Just an old woman's thought." Near the yew tree, Clara Dent stood with her arms folded tightly, her face pale but composed. She was young for such composure, Miss Marple noted, and there was a sharpness in her gaze that did not belong to grief. She kept looking not at the body but at the villagers. Mr. Fenwick hovered near his wife, murmuring reassurance. Mrs. Fenwick's lips moved silently as though counting prayers, but her eyes were fixed on the inspector with an intensity that suggested fear rather than sorrow. Inspector Mallory began interviewing people in rough order of proximity. He started with Mrs. Wilton, who described the toast in a fluttering rush, insisting Edwin Harper had seemed perfectly well, perhaps a little flushed, but nothing more. She had offered him lemonade. He had accepted. That was all. Who poured it? Mallory asked. Mrs. Wilton hesitated. The jug was on the table. Anyone could have. Did you see him drink it? Yes, he said quickly. Well, yes, I think so. He had the gladly. Mrs. Wilton flushed. Everything was happening at once. It was the first lie, Miss Marple thought. Not a malicious one. Merely a lie of certainty, spoken because uncertainty felt shameful. Mallory moved on to Mr. Ulcott, who insisted he had been at the raffle stall the entire time, and to the vicar's wife, who claimed she had been in the hall fetching more napkins. People spoke carefully, each statement shaped less by truth than by what they wished to be true about themselves. No one wanted to be too close. When Mallory reached Dr. Lewis, the doctor's account was crisp and professional, though Miss Marple noticed how he avoided mentioning the sharp scent from the glass until the inspector asked directly about it. It smelled odd, Dr. Lewis admitted. Not the lemonade itself. Something beneath it. And you said nothing? Mallory asked. I didn't want to start a panic, Dr. Lewis replied. A second lie, Miss Marple thought. Softer but more dangerous. People often claimed calm as their motive when what they truly meant was fear of being responsible for consequences. The inspector's gaze swept the lawn again. Who was with him just before he fell? There was a pause. Several people answered at once, overlapping and unhelpful. I spoke to him, only for a moment. He was right there by the arbour. He laughed at something I said. I hardly noticed him. Miss Marple listened to the language of avoidance. Hardly, only, just. People used small words like shields. Clara Dent stepped forward then, her voice clear. He spoke to Mrs. Fenwick, she said. Mrs. Fenwick made a small sound, half protest, half panic. That's not true. Clara's gaze did not waver. It is, by the roses, just before the toast. Inspector Mallory turned to Mrs. Fenwick. Did you speak to Mr. Harper? Mrs. Fenwick's hands clenched at her sides. Briefly, she said. Only briefly. What about? Mallory asked. Nothing, she said too quickly. Nothing important. Miss Marple saw Mr. Fenwick's jaw tighten, saw the way his eyes slid away from his wife's face. A private disagreement, she thought, or a shared secret. Inspector Mallory leaned slightly closer. Mrs. Fenwick. People don't describe conversations as nothing important unless they're trying to minimize them. Mrs. Fenwick's breath quickened. He asked about old times, she said. About when he lived here. He said he remembered the village fondly, that's all. Clara Dent's expression flickered, the faintest hint of disdain, as if she knew the story was incomplete. Inspector Mallory moved on, but Miss Marple did not. She watched Mrs. Fenwick carefully as the inspector's attention shifted. Mrs. Fenwick pressed her fingertips together again and again, as though rehearsing calmly. Constable Price collected the broken glass with careful hands, placing the pieces into a small evidence bag. Miss Marple caught the faintest motion near the tea table, a man's hand reaching for the lemonade jug, then stopping short as if he had remembered he was being observed. It was Mr. Edwin Harper's cousin, Mr. Basil Harper, who had arrived late to the fete and now stood, too close, his face solemn, his eyes darting. He withdrew his hand quickly and folded it into his pocket. Miss Marple's gaze rested on him for a moment, not accusingly, simply noticing. Inspector Mallory finished his first round of questions and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "All right," he said. "We'll do this properly. Dr. Lewis, I want you to arrange for the body to be taken in. Constable, cordon off the area. And everyone else, think carefully. If you've remembered anything at all, even something you think is insignificant, you tell me now." The crowd shifted, uneasy. No one moved forward. Miss Marple looked at the faces, the practiced sympathy, the guarded eyes, the way people measured one another now. The fete had become a theatre, and everyone was already choosing a role. She could already see the shape of the problem. Not simply a death, but a village full of stories, each edited, each softened, each arranged for survival. And somewhere among them, she was quite certain, was the one person whose lie was not meant to protect themselves from discomfort. It was meant to protect them from the truth. By the following morning, Barton Lee had transformed itself into a village of quiet certainty and louder whispers. The fate had been cleared away, bunting folded and tables stacked, but the conversations it had ignited lingered stubbornly in kitchens, shops, and gardens. People spoke in careful tones, offering opinions that felt oddly rehearsed, as though the night had given them time to decide what they believed. Miss Marple walked to the post office just after 9. She noticed how conversations faltered as she entered, then resumed with exaggerated normality. It was the sort of politeness that carried tension beneath it, like a table laid too carefully to be comfortable. "Such a shock," the postmistress said, handing over Miss Marple's letters. "No warning at all." "No," Miss Marple replied. "Things rarely give warnings when people are determined not to notice them." The postmistress blinked, then laughed uncertainly. Outside, Mrs. Fenwick stood speaking to Clara Dent, their heads bent together, voices low. When they noticed Miss Marple, the conversation ended abruptly. Mrs. Fenwick flushed and made an excuse about errands, while Clara's gaze lingered a fraction longer, sharp and assessing. Miss Marple continued on her way. Inspector Mallory arrived again mid-morning, accompanied by Constable Price, who carried a notebook already thick with scribbled names. The inspector established himself in the small sitting room at the vicarage, turning it into a temporary headquarters. One by one, villagers were invited in for further questioning. Miss Marple was called in early, more out of courtesy than suspicion. "You noticed the glass," Mallory said, not unkindly. "The smell." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It was faint but distinct. And you didn't mention it immediately." "No," she said calmly. "I wanted to see who else noticed it without being told." Mallory regarded her thoughtfully. "And Dr. Lewis," Miss Marple said. "And one other." "Who?" Mallory asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "If I were certain, Inspector, I should tell you. At present I am only observant." He nodded, neither satisfied nor dismissive. As she left, Miss Marple encountered Basil Harper waiting his turn. He stood stiffly, his hat clutched in both hands, his expression a careful blend of grief and apprehension. "A terrible business," he said at once, as though afraid of silence. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Deaths among family always are." Basil's mouth tightened. "Edwin and I weren't close. Not really. But blood is blood." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "and blood remembers." Basil looked at her sharply, then away. Later, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Fenwick, bringing with her a small basket of scones, a gesture that was rarely refused in Barton Lee. Mrs. Fenwick accepted them with nervous gratitude, ushering her inside and closing the door more firmly than necessary. "I still can't believe it," Mrs. Fenwick said, pressing her hands together. "Edwin always had a way of upsetting things." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Some people do." Mrs. Fenwick hesitated, then spoke in a rush. He came back acting as though nothing had happened, as though the past were just a misunderstanding. "And it wasn't?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Fenwick shook her head, her eyes bright. "No, it wasn't." "What did he say to you yesterday?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Fenwick's lips parted, then closed again. "Nothing important," she said, then stopped, visibly correcting herself. "That's not true. He said he remembered things differently. He said people had lied." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he name anyone?" "No," Mrs. Fenwick said, "but he didn't need to." Outside, Clara Dent watched the Fenwick house from the lane, her arms folded, her expression thoughtful. When Miss Marple emerged, Clara fell into step beside her as if by chance. "You ask interesting questions," Clara said lightly. "So do you," Miss Marple replied. Clara smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "People are saying Mrs. Fenwick had reason to hate Edwin Harper." "People say many things," Miss Marple said, Hatred is rarely so simple. And you don't believe it was her? Clara asked. I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that Mrs. Fenwick is frightened. Frightened people do not usually plan neatly. Clara considered this. Then who does? Miss Marple smiled and did not answer. That afternoon, Doctor. Lewis received preliminary findings from the laboratory. The substance found in Edwin Harper's system was confirmed to be poison, administered orally, fast-acting, and difficult to detect once metabolized. Inspector Mallory shared the news with a small group, and by evening the entire village knew. Poison changed the tone of everything. Accidents could be accepted, hearts could fail, poison implied intent, and intent demanded a culprit. By dusk, Barton Lee had produced its first. It must have been someone he spoke to, Mrs. Alcott said firmly, someone he upset. Yes, agreed another, someone with a grudge. Miss Marple listened from her place near the edge of the group, noting how easily the theory narrowed. Mrs. Fenwick's name was not spoken aloud, but it hovered nearby, shaped by glances and half-finished sentences. She had spoken to Edwin last. She had been shaken. She had a reason, people said, though no one explained precisely what that reason was. Inspector Mallory felt the pressure as keenly as anyone. A suspect who fit the shape of the village's discomfort was a tempting thing. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching lights appear one by one along the lane. She thought of Edwin Harper's words before he died. Some things are best left in the past. It was not a plea. It had been a warning. She thought, too, of the lies already told. Not grand lies, but small ones. Adjustments, omissions, each person smoothing their memory into something easier to live with. Everyone lied that night, she reflected. Some to protect themselves, some to protect others, and one, quite certainly, to kill. The challenge would not be discovering who had lied. It would be discovering whose lie had required a death to sustain it. By the second evening after Edwin Harper's death, Barton Lee had reached the point where patience thinned and certainty began to masquerade as clarity. The village disliked loose ends, and poison, once confirmed, demanded explanation. People wanted a reason they could understand, and a person they could quietly agree upon, so that life might resume its usual shape. That person, gradually and almost inevitably, became Mrs. Fenwick. It began with sympathy. Poor Mrs. Fenwick, people said, so pale and shaken. She'd always been sensitive. She'd clearly been deeply affected by Edwin's return. Sympathy, however, has a habit of turning on itself once fear enters the room. By the next morning, sympathy had hardened into speculation. She was the last one he spoke to, Mrs. Alcott murmured at the grocer's counter. And she looked furious afterward, someone else added. I noticed it at once. I heard there was history, a third voice said knowingly, though no one explained precisely what that history involved. Miss Marple listened, her basket resting lightly on her arm. She noted the certainty with which people repeated things they had not actually seen, the ease with which emotion was mistaken for motive. Mrs. Fenwick's distress, once a sign of shock, was now being reshaped into something more sinister. Inspector Mallory felt the pressure keenly. He summoned Mrs. Fenwick for a longer interview that afternoon, and the village noticed her absence at once. Curtains twitched. Conclusions formed. Miss Marple did not attend the interview, but she encountered Mr. Fenwick pacing outside the vicarage while it took place. His hands were clasped behind his back, his jaw set with rigid determination. They think it was her, he said abruptly, as though silence had become unbearable. Yes, Miss Marple replied gently. They often do. She would never hurt anyone, he said fiercely. Whatever Edwin did, whatever he said, it wouldn't matter. Words can matter a great deal, Miss Marple said, but not everyone responds to them in the same way. Mr. Fenwick stopped pacing and looked at her. You don't think she did it? No, Miss Marple said. I think Mrs. Fenwick is far too honest in her distress. That evening, Inspector Mallory emerged from the interview with a thoughtful frown. Mrs. He'd accused her of dishonesty, she said, of allowing others to believe a lie that had benefited her family. She had denied it, grown upset, and walked away. She was angry, Mallory told Constable Price, but anger alone isn't enough. Still, Price said, it's something. Yes, Mallory agreed, it's something. The village seized on it eagerly. Accused her, did he? Mrs. Wilton said later. Well, that explains it, doesn't it? Explain what? Miss Marple asked mildly. Mrs. Wilton flushed. Well, everything. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Explanations, she knew, were often chosen for convenience rather than truth. Meanwhile, another name began to surface quietly, though never with the same enthusiasm. Clara Dent's was mentioned occasionally, usually accompanied by a dismissive shrug. Too young, people said. Too clever, perhaps, but not the sort. Besides, she'd always admired Edwin, hadn't she? Miss Marple was not so sure. She encountered Clara that evening near the old footbridge. The young woman leaned against the railing, staring into the slow-moving water below. "They're circling Mrs. Fenwick," Clara said without preamble. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It's very efficient." "And wrong," Clara added. Miss Marple studied her. "Why do you say that?" "Because Edwin enjoyed provoking people," Clara said. "He liked to see how far he could push before something broke. Mrs. Fenwick would break inward, not outward." "An interesting distinction," Miss Marple said. Clara smiled thinly. "He pushed others too, just more quietly." "Did he push you?" Miss Marple asked. Clara hesitated. "He reminded me of things," she said finally, "of what people remember and what they choose not to do." Miss Marple nodded. Memory, she reflected, was proving to be at the heart of the matter. That night the police searched Edwin Harper's house. They found old letters, newspaper clippings, and photographs carefully preserved. Some were annotated in Edwin's hand. Names were circled, dates underlined. It was clear he had been keeping accounts. Inspector Mallory showed a selection to Miss Marple the following morning. He was digging, Mallory said, into the past, into people. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, and reminding them that he hadn't forgotten. "Mrs. Fenwick appears more than once," Mallory noted. "So do others," Miss Marple said gently, "though some may appear in subtler ways." Mallory looked at her sharply. "You think someone else felt more threatened?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that Mrs. Fenwick had already made peace with what Edwin was saying. She was frightened but not desperate. And desperation," Mallory said slowly, "is more dangerous than anger." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. As the day wore on, another detail returned to Miss Marple's mind. Edwin Harper had accepted the lemonade readily, without hesitation. He had trusted the hand that offered it. Trust, she reflected, was rarely extended to enemies. She remembered Clara Dent's composure at the fete, the way she had watched everyone else, not Edwin, the way she had spoken up, calmly, directing attention toward Mrs. Fenwick with remarkable precision. Miss Marple wondered whether that had been a concern or calculation. That evening she sat by her window as dusk gathered, knitting slowly. The village was quieter now, as though holding its breath. People believed they were close to the answer. That belief made them careless. Mrs. Fenwick was being shaped into the obvious suspect, and the police, under pressure, were tempted to agree. It was neat, it was understandable, and it allowed everyone else to step back into safety. Miss Marple sighed softly. The first suspect, she knew, was rarely the right one. They were chosen not because they fit the crime, but because they fit the story the village wanted to tell. Somewhere in Barton Lee, someone was listening to that story with great interest, and perhaps, just perhaps, with relief. By the 5th day after Edwin Harper's death, Barton Lee had settled into a pattern that Miss Marple recognized all too well. Suspicion had found a shape, and once shaped, it began to harden. The village moved more easily now, buoyed by the sense that the mystery was narrowing. People preferred a single focus for their fear, It allowed everything else to return to normal. Mrs. Fenwick was that focus. Her movements were watched. Her words were weighed. Even her silences were interpreted. When she walked into the grocer's, conversation paused for a fraction of a second too long. When she attended church, people noticed where she sat. Sympathy had drained away, replaced by something colder and more exacting. Miss Marple observed it quietly, with the same calm attention she had given to the fate itself. She encountered Mrs. Fenwick one morning outside the post office. The woman looked thinner, her face drawn with exhaustion. "They look at me as if I've already been judged," Mrs. Fenwick said softly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Judgment is often more comfortable than uncertainty." "I didn't kill him," Mrs. Fenwick whispered. "No," Miss Marple said. "You didn't." There was relief in Mrs. Fenwick's eyes, but also despair. "No one believes that." "Belief," Miss Marple said gently, "is not always the same as truth." That afternoon, Inspector Mallory returned to Edwin Harper's house for a second, more thorough search. Miss Marple was invited to accompany him, not as an official consultant, but as a familiar presence whose observations had already proved useful. The house was neat to the point of severity. Edwin had lived alone, and everything bore the mark of careful control. Files were arranged by date. Letters were bundled and labelled. Even old photographs were placed in envelopes with written notes. He was cataloguing his past, Mallory said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "not for memory, for leverage." They examined a small desk in the sitting room, where several folders lay open. Inside were documents related to village families, financial disputes, old disagreements, property boundaries, business partnerships that had failed. "This wasn't nostalgia," Mallory said. "This was preparation." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He intended to use what he knew." Mallory frowned, against whom perhaps not against Miss Marple, replied, "Perhaps simply to remind." They found Clara Dent's name in a ledger, written neatly beside a faded photograph of a much younger woman standing beside a man Miss Marple did not recognize. A note in Edwin's handwriting read, "Ask about mother." Old arrangement, unresolved. Mallory studied it. Clara Dent never mentioned her mother. "No," Miss Marple said. "Some histories are more useful and unspoken." Later that day, Miss Marple sought out Clara. She found her in the village library, sitting alone at a long table, pretending to read while clearly thinking about something else. "You're being watched," Clara said as Miss Marple approached. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "So are you." Clara's lips curved slightly. "People always watch when they're afraid." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "Fear sharpens attention." Clara closed her book. "They think it was Mrs. Fenwick." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And you don't?" "No," Miss Marple replied. Clara leaned forward. "Then who?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I'm more interested in why." Clara hesitated. "Edwin knew things about people, things they didn't want remembered." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He spoke to me before the toast," Clara continued. "Not kindly. He asked about my mother, about arrangements made years ago." "And what did you say?" Miss Marple asked. "I told him to mind his own business," Clara said. He laughed. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "He seems to have enjoyed laughter." Clara's gaze hardened. "He liked power, making people uncomfortable." "Power," Miss Marple said softly, "is often mistaken for confidence." Clara fell silent. That evening, Inspector Mallory called on Miss Marple again. "The pressure's building," he said frankly. "The village wants an arrest." "Mrs. Fenwick fits the narrative." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Narratives are very persuasive. And you think it's wrong?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that the person who poisoned Edwin Harper was not reacting in anger, but acting in calculation." Mallory considered this. Meaning that they had thought about the method, the setting, and the story that would follow, Miss Marple said. "They chose poison because it looks like weakness. They chose the fate because it diffuses responsibility, and they relied on the village to do the rest. And who benefits from Mrs. Fenwick being blamed? Mallory asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Who benefits from the past staying buried? She asked instead. Mallory was silent. The next morning brought a subtle but telling change. The lemonade jug from the fete was returned from the laboratory. No poison residue was found in the jug itself. The glass, however, showed traces of contamination along the rim. It was added to the glass, Mallory said, when he shared the result with Miss Marple. Not the jug. Yes, Miss Marple said. That suggests intention. And proximity, Mallory added. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. And trust. Edwin Harper had not feared the person who handed him the glass. He had accepted it without hesitation. Miss Marple reflected that this detail was far more revealing than any chemical report. Trust was not extended to enemies. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked through the village green. She noticed Clara Dent standing near the old oak, watching the path that led from Edwin's house. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were alert. "You're waiting," Miss Marple said gently. "For what?" Clara asked. "For the story to settle," Miss Marple replied. "Or for it to change?" Clara studied her. "You think it will?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "because the wrong story always creates tension." As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected that the investigation had entered its most dangerous phase. The village believed it understood what had happened. The police were under pressure to confirm it, and the true killer, whoever they were, was benefiting from that certainty. Mrs. Fenwick was being pushed into the role of the obvious suspect, and everyone else was stepping back into comfort. Miss Marple knew that comfort was rarely innocent. Somewhere in Barton Lee, someone was watching the suspicion settle on the wrong shoulders. And someone, she was quite sure, was beginning to feel safe. That was always the moment she knew when mistakes were made. The shift in the village's mood became unmistakable by the middle of the week. Barton Lee had grown restless. Certainty hovered just out of reach, and that made people irritable. Conversations shortened. Smiles tightened. Everyone wanted the matter concluded, and impatience began to outweigh caution. Inspector Mallory felt it too. He called on Miss Marple that afternoon, removing his hat with a faintly apologetic air as he stepped into her sitting room. She offered him tea, which he accepted gratefully, settling into the chair opposite her with the weariness of a man carrying more than evidence. "We're not there yet," he said bluntly. "But the village thinks we are." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Villages often do." Mallory sighed. "Mrs. Fenwick has motive enough to satisfy them. History, confrontation, visible distress. It's plausible. Plausible is not the same as probable," Miss Marple said gently. "No," Mallory agreed. "But it's close enough for comfort." Miss Marple poured the tea slowly. "Tell me, Inspector, has Mrs. Fenwick altered her account at all?" "No," Mallory said. "Not once. She's repeated it exactly each time." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "That's what troubles me." Mallory looked up. "Troubles you?" "Truth," Miss Marple explained, wobbles slightly. "Even when people are honest. Memory shifts. Emphasis changes. Lies, on the other hand, are often rehearsed until they become rigid." Mallory frowned. "You think someone else is rehearsing." "I think," Miss Marple said, "that someone else has had a great deal of time to prepare." After Mallory left, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, a pace unhurried, her attention everywhere. She passed Mrs. Wilton's house, where voices murmured urgently behind closed curtains. She passed the Fenwick cottage, its windows dark, the door firmly shut. And she passed Clara Dent's small bungalow, where Clara sat on the front step, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the lane with an expression that was neither grief nor fear, but anticipation. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Clara said pleasantly. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple replied, stopping. "They're saying it will all be sorted soon." Clara went on, "that it was bound to come to light." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "bound things often are." Clara smiled faintly. "You don't sound convinced." "I seldom am," Miss Marple replied. Clara tilted her head. "Do you think Mrs. Fenwick is capable of murder?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mrs. Fenwick is capable of suffering." "That is not the same thing." Clara considered this. "Edwin made people suffer," she said. "He enjoyed it." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But enjoyment and danger are not always aligned." Clara's gaze sharpened. "You think someone else enjoyed it more?" Miss Marple smiled. "I think someone else found it necessary." That evening, another development unsettled the case. Dr. Lewis requested a private word with Inspector Mallory, and news of it spread quickly, as news always did. By the time Miss Marple heard of it, the story had already acquired embellishments. Dr. Lewis, it transpired, had remembered something he had dismissed at the time of Edwin Harper's collapse. While kneeling beside him, he noticed faint staining on Edwin's fingers, barely visible, as though he had handled something shortly before drinking the lemonade. "Could have been the glass," Mallory said later, recounting it to Miss Marple. "Yes," she agreed, "or something else entirely." The glass itself was re-examined. No fingerprints of use beyond Edwin's and Mrs. Wilton's were found on the outside. The inside, however, revealed traces of careful handling, as though someone had wiped it clean without disturbing the contents. "Someone wanted to be sure," Mallory said grimly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "very sure." That night Miss Marple replayed the fate in her mind once more, not as a sequence of events, but as a series of interactions. Who spoke, who listened, who watched? She recalled how Clara Dent had stood apart from the excitement, her gaze moving constantly, cataloguing reactions. She recalled how Clara had spoken up at just the right moment, guiding attention toward Mrs. Fenwick with calm authority. She also recalled something smaller. After the toast, just before Edwin Harper collapsed, there had been a brief confusion near the tea table. Someone had knocked a stack of cups, and Clara had stepped forward quickly to help, lifting glasses, rearranging them, restoring order. It was efficient, unremarkable. Unless, Miss Marple reflected, one knew exactly what one needed to touch. The following morning, Inspector Mallory summoned Clara Dent for a longer interview. She arrived composed, dressed neatly, her expression attentive. She answered questions clearly, without hesitation. Yes, she had spoken to Edwin. Yes, she had admired his confidence. Yes, she had helped near the tea table. "Why did you step in?" Mallory asked. Clara smiled. It was chaos. Someone had to. Mallory watched her closely. "You're very calm." "I like things orderly," Clara replied. "Disorder makes people careless." Miss Marple, hearing this later, closed her eyes briefly. By midday, Mallory returned to Rose Cottage once more. His manner altered. He was no longer tired. He was alert. "You were right," he said, "about desperation." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It sharpens the mind." "Edwin Harper wasn't threatening Mrs. Fenwick," Mallory went on. "He was pressuring Clara. He knew something about her father, about money that disappeared years ago. He intended to make it public. And Clara," Miss Marple said softly, "could not allow that." Mallory nodded. She was always watching, always positioning herself. "We missed it because she seemed helpful." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "helpfulness is very persuasive." "And everyone lied," Mallory added. "Not just her." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But only one lie required a death to maintain it." That evening Barton Lee felt different. The air had shifted. People sensed that the shape of the story was changing, though they did not yet know how. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting slowly, listening to footsteps pass along the lane. The case was nearing its most dangerous moment, the moment when the truth began to surface, and the person who had acted to conceal it realized that concealment was no longer possible. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. Soon, she knew, someone would be forced to choose between silence and exposure, and that choice, more than poison or motive, would tell her everything she needed to know. The tension that followed Inspector Mallory's renewed focus on Clara Dent settled over Barton Lee like a mist that refused to lift. People sensed that the story they had been repeating to themselves was no longer reliable, and that awareness made them cautious. Conversations grew quieter, glances more deliberate. The village was listening now, not just speaking. Clara Dent, for her part, did not retreat. She continued her routines with meticulous precision. She went to the shop at her usual hour, greeted neighbors with polite composure, and attended church on Sunday with her head held high. To casual observation, she appeared unaffected by the shift in scrutiny. Miss Marple, however, noticed the difference immediately. Clara was no longer watching others out of curiosity. She was watching to measure risk. Miss Marple encountered her one afternoon near the old stone wall by the fields. Clara paused, smiling as though pleased by the coincidence. "You've been busy lately," Clara said lightly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Busy times tend to reveal character." Clara's smile thinned. "People are saying all sorts of things. They usually do," Miss Marple said, "especially when they're afraid of being mistaken." "And you?" Clara asked. "Are you afraid of being mistaken?" Miss Marple considered her. "No," she said gently, "only by being inattentive." Clara laughed softly. "You see more than most." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but only because I listen longer." That evening, Inspector Mallory made a calculated decision. Acting on Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, he allowed a rumor to circulate. It was not an official statement, merely a carefully worded comment overheard at the vicarage and repeated with increasing confidence. A witness had come forward claiming Edwin Harper intended to make a public disclosure that evening, naming the person who had wronged him years ago. The effect was immediate. Mrs. Fenwick grew pale and withdrawn, but her distress remained consistent with what it had always been, sadness and fear, not urgency. Clara, however, reacted differently. She arrived at the vicarage within an hour, asking to speak with Inspector Mallory privately. Miss Marple learned of this later, but she could imagine the scene with perfect clarity. Clara would have sat very straight, her hands folded neatly. She would have spoken calmly, offering context, suggesting that Edwin had exaggerated his importance, that he enjoyed causing unrest. She would have framed herself as helpful, concerned for the village's peace. What she would not have done was wait. Inspector Mallory, for his part, allowed her to speak at length. He noted how quickly she had come, how eager she was to manage the narrative. When he mentioned casually that Edwin had left behind notes indicating a financial scandal involving her father, Clara's composure slipped for just a fraction of a second. Enough. Later that night, Miss Marple received a quiet knock at her door. Inspector Mallory stood outside, his expression thoughtful, almost grave. "She's afraid," he said simply. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and fear makes people careless." "We found the connection," Mallory went on. "Her father's business collapsed years ago. Money vanished. Edwin Harper knew why. He helped conceal it, and returned to reveal it," Miss Marple said. "Yes, he wanted recognition. Power, apologies." Mallory exhaled. Clara stood to lose everything. Miss Marple nodded, including her carefully constructed future. The following morning, Inspector Mallory invited several villagers to the vicarage, Clara among them. It was framed as a general discussion, a clarification of timelines. Miss Marple attended, seated quietly near the window, knitting in her lap. Mallory spoke calmly, outlining Edwin Harper's movements that afternoon, the toast, the lemonade, the collapse. He spoke of the lies told, not accusations, merely observations, how memories had been adjusted, how details had been softened. "Everyone here," he said, "has lied in some way. Out of fear, out of kindness, out of habit." Clara listened intently, her face composed. "But one lie," Mallory continued, "required planning, opportunity, and control." He turned to Clara. "You were near the tea table when the glasses were disturbed." "Yes," Clara said evenly, "I helped, and you were calm enough to do so deliberately," Mallory said. "You knew which glass Edwin would take. You had already encouraged him toward it." Clara's eyes flicked just once toward Miss Marple. Miss Marple met her gaze with mild curiosity, nothing more. "You moved the glass," Mallory went on. "You wiped it afterward, and you spoke up at just the right moment to steer attention elsewhere." Clara's hands tightened in her lap. "You're guessing." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "He's observing." The room was very quiet. Clara rose slowly. "Edwin Harper was going to ruin my family," she said. "He enjoyed it. He wanted everyone to watch." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "He was very fond of an audience. I didn't mean for it to happen so quickly," Clara said. "I only wanted him silenced." "Intent," Miss Marple said gently, "often matters less than result." Clara's composure finally broke then. Her voice shook, though her posture remained rigid. "Everyone lies," she said bitterly. "I just refuse to let his lie destroy us." Inspector Mallory stepped forward. "Clara Dent, I'm placing you under arrest." She did not resist. As she was led away, the villagers sat in stunned silence, not because the truth had been revealed, but because it had revealed something about them as well. How easily they had accepted a simpler story, how readily they had shaped their memories to fit it. Later, as Miss Marple walked home beneath a darkening sky, she reflected on the evening of the fete, the laughter, the toast, the casual encouragement and small adjustments that had led to a man's death. Everyone had lied that night, in one way or another. But only one lie had been calculated enough to kill. Miss Marple closed her gate behind her and paused for a moment, listening to the quiet village settle around her. The final revelation had not come with drama or outrage. It had come, as it always did, with a small human reaction, a flicker of fear, a need to control, and the mistaken belief that no one was watching closely enough. In the days following Clara Dent's arrest, Barton Lee moved with the careful politeness of people uncertain where they now stood with one another. The truth had arrived quietly, without the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation, and it left behind a residue of discomfort that could not be brushed away by routine alone. Everyone had something to reconsider, not least their own memories of the fete. Miss Marple observed the change with gentle attentiveness. People still greeted one another, still exchanged small talk about the weather and the state of the roses, but there was a new pause before certain names were spoken. Clara Dent's bungalow stood empty now, its curtains drawn, its garden already beginning to look neglected. Some villagers avoided passing it altogether, while others slowed instinctively, as though proximity might offer explanation. Mrs. Fenwick emerged from her house for the first time in days, walking with her husband along the lane. Her face looked thinner, her eyes tired, but there was a steadiness to her now that had been absent before. She stopped Miss Marple and thanked her, though she did not quite know what she was thanking her for. "You listened," Mrs. Fenwick said finally, when everyone else decided. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Listening is often more useful than deciding." Inspector Mallory remained in Barton Lee longer than expected, completing formalities and answering questions that were less about evidence than reassurance. The villagers wanted to know how such a thing could have happened among them. Mallory, careful and honest, did not soften his answers. Because it was familiar, he said more than once, because no one expected danger to look like that. That explanation satisfied no one entirely, which Miss Marple thought appropriate. Complete satisfaction had a way of discouraging reflection. Colleagues of Edwin Harper from his earlier life were contacted, and the shape of his past emerged more clearly. He had been a man who thrived on leverage, on knowing things others wished forgotten. He had enjoyed the slow pressure of implication more than open accusation. Returning to Barton Lee had given him the audience he wanted, and the fate had offered the stage. Miss Marple reflected that such men rarely understood the risk they created for themselves. They believed knowledge was power, forgetting that power provoked fear as often as submission. One afternoon, Inspector Mallory came to Rose Cottage to say his goodbyes. He looked older than when he had arrived, though his manner was lighter now that the case had settled. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "not for solving it, but for slowing it down." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "haste is very rarely innocent." He hesitated at the door. "It troubles me," he admitted, "that everyone lied." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not all lies are the same." Mallory nodded. "That's what I'll remember." After he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She considered Clara Dent, bright and composed, who had believed she could manage the past if she controlled the present. Clara had lied not only to others, but to herself, convincing herself that necessity excused intention. She also thought of the smaller lies, Mrs. Wilton's certainty where there had been none, Dr. Lewis's hesitation disguised as calm, the villagers' willingness to accept a story that freed them from discomfort. Those lies had not killed Edwin Harper, but they had nearly protected the one who did. By the end of the week, Barton Lee resumed its routines with visible effort. The shop reopened fully. The vicar announced upcoming events. The fete committee met again, though no one mentioned next summer's plans just yet. Life insisted on continuing, and the village complied. Miss Marple attended church on Sunday and sat in her usual place. She noticed how the hymns sounded slightly different now, how certain words lingered. Forgiveness, truth, witness. People sang them carefully. After the service, she walked home along the familiar lane. The hedges rustled softly in the breeze. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Ordinary sounds, comforting and unchanged. She paused briefly near the green where the fete had taken place. The grass bore no sign of what had happened, and the bunting had long since been stored away. Only memory marked the spot now, and memory, she knew, was a fragile thing. Edwin Harper would be remembered differently by different people. Some would recall his charm, others his cruelty. Clara Dent would be spoken of with a mixture of pity and disapproval, her intelligence reinterpreted as coldness, her composure as calculation. The village would adjust its narratives until they felt safe enough to live with. Miss Marple did not begrudge them that. People needed stories to endure. That evening she sat by her window, the lamplight warm against the gathering dusk. She poured herself a cup of tea and allowed her thoughts to settle. The case had been resolved, but its lesson remained, quiet and insistent. Everyone had lied that night because everyone had wanted something preserved, peace, reputation, certainty, the past as they preferred to remember it. Only one person had decided that preservation required death. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly consistent. People lied not because they were wicked, but because they were afraid of blame, of loss, of being seen too clearly, and occasionally that fear hardened into resolve. Outside, Barton Lee settled into the evening. Lights appeared in the windows, curtains were drawn. The village, outwardly unchanged, carried its secret knowledge inward now. Miss Marple reached for her knitting again, the needles clicking softly. Tomorrow there would be errands and letters and small domestic concerns. Life would go on, as it always did. But she suspected that for a long time yet, whenever the village gathered for tea or celebration, There would be a moment of pause, a quiet memory, and perhaps, just perhaps, a little more honesty. In the quiet that followed the village's gradual return to routine, Barton Lee found itself grappling with something more persistent than shock. The truth, once uncovered, did not settle neatly into place. It lingered, unsettling familiar assumptions and forcing people to confront the uncomfortable spaces between intention and consequence. Miss Marple sensed this unease most keenly in the small, ordinary encounters of daily life. At the grocer's, she noticed how Mrs. Wilton hesitated before speaking, as though measuring each word for accuracy rather than convenience. At the post office, the postmistress corrected herself twice while recounting the fate, revising her own memory as if afraid of repeating a falsehood too confidently. These were small changes, almost imperceptible. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that such shifts often mattered more than dramatic gestures. Clara Dent's absence was felt everywhere. Her bungalow remained shuttered, its neatness already giving way to neglect. The village spoke of her cautiously now, preferring generalities to specifics. She had been under strain, people said, too clever for her own good. No one spoke of the careful planning, the deliberate choices. It was easier to attribute her actions to temperament than to intention. Miss Marple thought that unfair, though not unexpected. She was asked more than once how she had known. Each time she deflected the question with mild remarks about coincidence or experience. Explanations, she believed, too often allowed people to distance themselves from responsibility. Better to let them sit with the discomfort of not knowing everything. Inspector Mallory returned briefly at the end of the week to complete final arrangements. He called on Miss Marple once more, his manner reflective rather than investigative. She admitted enough to secure conviction, he said, but I doubt she'll ever fully explain herself. No, Miss Marple replied, people rarely do. They explain only as much as they can live with. Mallory nodded. What troubles me is how close we came to being wrong. Yes, Miss Marple said gently, that happens more often than we like to admit. After he left, Miss Marple took a longer walk than usual, circling the village and its edges. She passed the Fenwick house, where Mrs. Fenwick stood in the garden, pruning roses with renewed attention. There was a steadiness in her movements now, as though the danger had passed, but the memory of it remained close at hand. You were right, Mrs. Fenwick said quietly when she noticed Miss Marple. About people choosing stories. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Stories are comforting. And dangerous, Mrs. Fenwick added. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only when we stop questioning them. Further along the lane she encountered Dr. Lewis, who greeted her with reserved warmth. He spoke briefly of the laboratory results, of timelines and procedures, but Miss Marple noticed how he avoided speaking of his own hesitation that day. You trusted your instincts eventually, she said kindly. Yes, he replied, but not soon enough. Soon enough, Miss Marple said, is a difficult standard. The important thing is that you did not ignore them entirely. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window as dusk gathered, reflecting on the final shape of the case. Clara Dent had acted out of fear, but fear sharpened by preparation. She had not lashed out in a moment of passion. She had observed, calculated, and chosen her moment carefully. That distinction mattered. So did the fact that Edwin Harper had contributed to his own fate. He had believed that knowledge gave him immunity, that exposing others' secrets made him untouchable. He had not understood that fear could be as potent a motivator as guilt. Miss Marple thought, too, of the village itself, of how quickly suspicion had settled on Mrs. Fenwick because it fit a narrative everyone recognized. An emotional woman, a troubled past. It was easier to believe that story than to examine quieter, more deliberate behavior. Everyone had lied that night, she reflected again. Some lies had been reflexive, spoken to avoid embarrassment or discomfort. Others had been protective, intended to shield loved ones. and one had been carefully constructed, designed to direct attention away from itself. The difference lay not in the act of lying, but in its purpose. As the days passed, Barton Lee slowly absorbed this lesson, though not consciously. People grew slightly more attentive to one another's words, more cautious about repeating assumptions. It would not last forever. Human nature rarely allows permanent change, but for now there was an awareness that had not been there before. Miss Marple received a letter from a distant acquaintance, thanking her for advice given long ago. She smiled as she read it, recognizing the pattern. People often sought clarity after witnessing confusion, as though order might be restored by proximity. She set the letter aside and poured herself a cup of tea. Outside, the village settled into the night. Lights glowed softly behind curtains. Somewhere, a radio played a familiar tune. Barton Lee looked as it always had, peaceful and contained. Yet beneath that calm, something had shifted. The village had learned, however briefly, that truth was not always loud, and danger did not always announce itself with violence or anger. Sometimes it arrived in careful words, helpful gestures, and the quiet confidence of someone who believed themselves in control. Miss Marple watched the lane until it emptied of movement. Tomorrow, she knew, the final formalities would be concluded. The case would be closed, the narrative settled into something the village could live with, and then life would continue. She reached for her knitting and began again, the familiar rhythm soothing. There remained one final reflection, one last quiet understanding that had not yet fully settled. The aftermath, she knew, was not about justice alone. It was about memory, and how people chose, after everything was done, to remember what they had been so determined not to see. The official conclusion of the case arrived quietly, without ceremony. A typed notice was posted in the village shop window for a single afternoon, then removed at Mrs. Wilton's request, as though its presence were too stark a reminder of how fragile appearances could be. Clara Dent had been formally charged. The matter would pass from Barton Lee's hands into those of courts and papers and distant judgments. For the village, the story was effectively over. Living with it, however, had only just begun. Miss Marple noticed how Barton Lee resumed its routines with a particular attentiveness, as though everyone were trying to prove, to themselves more than to others, that normality could still be trusted. People greeted one another with warmth that felt a shade more deliberate. Invitations were extended carefully. Kindness was offered with a brief inward pause, as if each person were unconsciously asking whether it was genuine or simply expected. The parish hall reopened fully at the end of the month. Tables were set out again, though spaced a little farther apart than before. When tea was poured, hands hesitated briefly before passing cups, and there was a faint shared awareness that lingered around the refreshments. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt it. Miss Marple attended the first supper, as she always had. She accepted her tea, thanked the person beside her, and took her seat without comment. She observed quietly, her mild expression revealing nothing. The village, she suspected, took comfort in her presence. She represented continuity, reassurance that not everything had changed beyond recognition. Mrs. Fenwick sat across the room, speaking softly with her husband. There was relief in her posture now, though also a lingering sadness. She caught Miss Marple's eye once and inclined her head slightly, a gesture of gratitude that required no words. Edwin Harper's name was mentioned only once that evening, and then obliquely. Someone referred to what happened last summer, and the conversation moved on with surprising speed. Memory, Miss Marple reflected, was selective not because people were dishonest, but because they were merciful to themselves. As the evening ended, Miss Marple walked home beneath a clear sky. The lane was quiet, the hedges rustling faintly in the breeze. Barton Lee looked as it always had, peaceful and contained, its lamplit windows revealing nothing of the thoughts within. She paused at her gate and looked back once more, considering the shape of events now that they were complete. Clara Dent had been intelligent, observant, and precise. She had watched people closely, just as Miss Marple did, but where Miss Marple observed to understand, Clara had observed to control. She had believed that knowledge could be arranged like furniture, moved into positions of advantage. She had underestimated one thing only, the way fear altered behavior. Edwin Harper, too, had misjudged the nature of power. He had treated memory as a weapon, forgetting that weapons provoked defense. His return to Barton Lee had been an assertion, a challenge disguised as charm. He had not expected that someone would answer it so decisively, and the village itself had played its part, not through malice but through convenience. It had chosen the simplest explanation, the most familiar pattern, and nearly allowed it to harden into truth. That, Miss Marple knew, was how many injustices began, not with cruelty, but with comfort. Inside her cottage, she lit the lamp and set her handbag aside. The familiar room welcomed her back, unchanged and reassuring. She prepared a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the darkness settle fully over the lane. Tomorrow would bring small concerns, a letter to answer, a visit to the shops, perhaps a neighbour seeking advice for something troubling but undefined. Life would continue, composed of moments that seemed harmless until, occasionally, they were not. Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed herself a thoughtful pause. The lesson of Barton Lee, she reflected, was not that everyone lied. That was hardly news. But that lies took many forms. Some were born of fear, some kind of kindness, some of my habits, and one that night had been deliberate enough to kill. The difference had not been in the words spoken, but in the intent behind them. Outside, the village slept. Miss Marple remained by her window a little longer, content in the quiet knowledge that while people might forget the details, the pattern would repeat itself elsewhere, as it always did. And when it did, someone would need to notice the smallest things, the pauses, the careful phrasing, the person who watched a little too closely. She finished her tea, set the cup aside, and reached for her knitting. The needles clicked softly, steady and patient. Everyone had lied that night. But the truth, as it so often did, had waited calmly until someone was willing to look past the lie that felt most comfortable and attend instead to the one that could not afford to be questioned. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself and continued knitting, the quiet rhythm of it matching the settled peace of the village beyond her window.